Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast Summer Rewind Edition. We will be running back some of the many great guest interviews from our Imprint Weekly Podcast archive all the way up through Labor Day. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of The Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at the Imprint News. You can also sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters. And for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business policy and practice. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is also a member of the Safe Camp Audio Network. You can check out our show page and all of Safe Camp's other great podcasts at safecampaudio.org on the web or at safecampaudio on all social media. All right, so on week 3 of the Summer Rewind series, we're going to feature an interview that, despite the fact that we were pretty new when this came out, this is our 27th episode ever. It is, I believe, still our most listened to interview of all time, and that is attributable to the guest, well-known author and legal scholar Dorothy Roberts. This interview came out in March of 2021. That was 20 years after Roberts had published Shattered Bonds, The Color of Child Welfare. And 2 decades ago, at the time she wrote it, she concluded the book proposing to abolish the child welfare field as we know it to be replaced by an entirely new system. So fast forward to our conversation in 2021, she told me on this interview that she no longer believed that a system can work in a racially just or socioeconomically just way. And she teased the fact that she had begun work on a new book, which was called Torn Apart: How the Child Welfare System Destroys Black Families. It came out the next year after this conversation. So in this interview, we talk about the abolition movement in child welfare, and I think most importantly, she covers the concept of non-reformist reform, which I think became a bigger point of conversation after this, the discussion of what effort at change would constitute a meaningful step, even to somebody who would prefer no system at all, as opposed to something that that person would view as incremental and thus protective generally of the status quo. And that is rooted in the belief that Roberts and others have that anything incremental, even if it could generally be described as good, is not supportable in that it lends credence to the premise that the system itself is good. So without further ado, enjoy my conversation from March of 2021 with Dorothy Roberts. Okay, we are joined today by Dorothy Roberts, Professor of Law and Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania and Director of the Penn Program on Race, Science, and Society, who will keynote a conference this week at Columbia University called Strengthened Bonds: Abolishing the Child Welfare System and Re-envisioning Child Well-Being. And the name is not a coincidence. Professor Roberts wrote Shattered Bonds: The Color of Child Welfare 20 years ago, which made the case that the child welfare system was unnecessarily intervening in the lives of many poor families, and especially and disproportionately Black families. So, you wrote a big deal book when they name a conference after it. Professor Roberts, thanks for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Thanks, John. It's my pleasure to be here. And thanks for your podcast, which I listen to regularly.
Well, I appreciate you listening. So we always start off a little light here. I'm just going to ask you to give me one of the following. Give me your favorite movie or TV show, book, musical act, or sports team.
Okay, that's really hard, but I just finished rereading the autobiography of Malcolm X because I wanted to write about his experience of being taken from his family and put in foster care. And it just reminded me of what a great book that was. So I'm going to pick the autobiography of Malcolm X.
Great pick. And a good segue to this, because I want you to start here by taking me back to the late 1990s, I guess. Do you remember what specifically inspired you to write Shattered Bonds? I mean, I'm sure it was a lot of things, but was there like a match-striking moment, of sorts where you were like, I'm going to do this book?
Yeah, well, I was working on a different book, Killing the Black Body, which is about the regulation of Black women's childbearing, which was sparked by the arrests of Black women across the country for drug use during pregnancy. And while working on that, I got involved in just finding out about all the women whose babies were taken from them at birth. So I was focusing on prosecutions, which affected hundreds of women, but then I found out there were thousands and thousands of babies who were being taken, mostly from Black mothers during the so-called crack epidemic. And when I saw those figures and didn't know very much about the child welfare system and couldn't figure out why there wasn't more alarm that there were so many Black children being taken from their families. That's what triggered my interest in looking into it more and eventually writing a book about it.
So it's been 20 years. Has your view of the child welfare system changed substantially in these 2 decades? I guess what I'm asking is, I'm sure you're going to talk about it this week. So give us a sneak preview. What are you planning to talk about? And I heard you're planning a book as well. What's changed in your mind?
Well, what has changed mostly for me is that the problems I wrote about 20 years ago haven't been solved by lots of reform efforts. So when I wrote Shattered Bonds, the term racial disproportionality, either it hadn't been coined yet or it wasn't used a lot, but in the last 20 years, everybody's talking about it. There's been commissions and committees and task forces. I've spoken to lots of them. I've given trainings to lots of social workers, and I've given countless lectures. I worked for 9 years on class action settlement in Washington State that was supposed to reform foster care in Washington State. 9 whole years of flying to Seattle and sitting in meetings at the airport. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. And none of that has substantially changed what goes on in the child welfare system. It continues to be a system designed to police families, to threaten them with taking their children away, to try to solve the problems of structural inequalities by blaming parents and destroying families. And that has not changed. So what has changed mostly for me is understanding that it has to be abolished, that more reforms aren't going to fix it. And that's partly out of my experience of failed reforms, being involved in failed reforms myself and witnessing lots of them. And also the experience of being involved with the prison abolition movement and understanding what abolition means. That it means dismantling systems that were designed to be oppressive. And because of that design, they can't be fixed, they can't be tweaked, reforms aren't going to work. And also understanding that abolition means building a different world where we don't need to take children away from their families to solve their problems. We don't need to cage people, whether we're talking about confining them in prisons or confining them in foster care. We want a world where that doesn't have to happen, and it's unimaginable that that's how we would treat children and families.
So I want to kind of stake out what you mean exactly when you say abolition, because it's obviously a word with a lot of power. When you just asked 100 people on the street, what do you think of when you think of abolition? They think of slavery. We got rid of it entirely. And I guess one way to come at it is, what would have to happen for you to consider the existing child welfare system to have been abolished?
That there isn't a system at all.
At all?
Yeah, I think we don't want to replace it with a system. It's interesting you should ask that question, because in Shattered Bonds, in the introduction, I do say that we need to abolish the system. I actually used that word 20 years ago, abolish. And then I say, and replace it with a better system or something to that effect. And we don't want a system that addresses the needs of families by trying to intervene after they've already been harmed by unequal structures in our society. And so that's part of the idea of a system itself, is that it is a way of dealing with the problems that have already happened. What we want is a very different approach altogether that creates a world where those problems don't occur because we've both addressed the underlying inequities that cause them, but also we don't even think about how we would support children and families by intervening in them. That isn't even the approach we should take at all. It's both thinking about how we build a different kind of society that's not so unequal, that produces the hardships that children and families are facing, but also thinking about very different ways within communities of supporting each other. And that's not a system. That's a completely different kind of relationship that we have with each other.
So like you said, you've been involved before in a kind of peak of interest around the issue of racism and racial bias and child welfare. Is there anything palpably different this time around than the one you just mentioned, where you're going to Washington all the time and you're involved in all these coalitions before? Like, what feels or is different now than, say, in the late 2000s, I guess?
Yeah, well, this is another big change, is that there are emerging organizations, I would even say a movement of people that's similar to the kind of movement the prison abolition movement has emerged to be. That's not looking to reform things, that really is imagining innovative ways of both radically changing what we're doing now. So, for example, thinking innovatively and creatively and boldly about the whole idea of mandated reporting, the whole idea of foster care, the whole idea of parental training, just thinking radically about, are those really helpful ways to make us safer, really helpful ways to support families? And then at the same time, it's not just how do we dismantle what we have now, but what are ways to get to a point where we have a society that has community-based ways of supporting children and families. And so there are steps that we're thinking about in between, like getting representation for parents, developing family defense in the meantime, mutual aid within communities that can address the problems and needs that families have. So what kinds of legislation can we get passed? What kinds of community networks can we build? That's very different from the kinds of reform efforts, which were mostly geared at how do we reduce the racial disproportionality, keep the system, but just reduce racial disproportionality within it. This is really, how can we figure out and build a completely different way of meeting human needs in families?
I would imagine that's just as somebody who's really plugged into child welfare and what's going on, kind of a difficult philosophical battle you must have over and over again, which is what things that people are trying to do to change the system are worth endorsing as worth the time to do versus a change that I'm guessing, as somebody who wants to just get rid of it entirely, makes it look better, but you don't feel really is. And so.
Yeah, well, that is a problem that comes up in any abolitionist movement. It's something that prison abolitionists have thought very deeply about and have even come up with charts to tell you. And the term non-reformist reform. So reforms that
non-reformist reform. That's new to me.
Exactly.
That's interesting.
So they're reforms because they're not a complete dismantling. And obviously we can't completely dismantle any system in the near future. but we have to take incremental steps toward it. And your question is exactly the question of what is a non-reformist reform? So it's a reform that does move us toward abolition, but we recognize it's not the whole thing. And so that's something that prison abolitionists have spent a lot of time reading about, strategizing, writing about. That in our movement, it's, we have to get to that point. This is going to take a lot of work. And we're at a point where we need to engage in these difficult conversations. I don't think they're easy answers to these questions, but I think, for example, good representation of parents in child welfare proceedings isn't that's not abolition if you're still working within the system, but I believe it's a non-reformist reform. It's a reform that will bring us closer to abolition, and also that eases the suffering of people who are being impacted by a system that can be very brutal and violent and traumatic.
So you mentioned legal counsel, which the last administration freed up a lot of federal dollars to help build, I guess indirectly. They didn't really mandate that it was good legal counsel. They also signed into law the Family First Act. I'm curious where you come down on that. Is that non-reformist reform? I kind of view the Family First Act as putting money and resources into something the feds had already asked of states, which is to make reasonable efforts to not take kids into foster care.
Yeah.
So it's like 20 years, 15 years later, putting some money up. So what do you think of that?
Yeah, they were supposed to do that from 1980.
Right.
And they haven't been. And people have been pointing out over and over again, I pointed this out in Shattered Bonds, that reasonable efforts often is just a way of saying, well, we tried, but not really trying as an excuse to terminate parental rights. I think you're right that all it does is put money into what federal law had already required and wasn't being followed. But the problem for me with it is that it still is within this framework of removing children. So you get the money in order to prevent the placement of children in foster care where the family is already at risk for being split up and the kids put in foster care. So it still has, as many of these reforms have, the fundamental approach of threatening to break up families as the way we're going to address the needs of children. As long as that fundamental approach is there, we are not going to have a just and anti-racist, anti-sexist, and anti-classist system. We're going to continue to have a system that is targeted at the most marginalized people in our society. And that's for a reason. They're targeted in order to blame them for the harms to children that are caused by structural inequalities like poverty and racism, residential segregation, the lack of supports for families, discrimination in employment, low wage work. I could go on and on all the reasons why we have children in need in America. It's not because of their parents, it's because of the way in which our society is structured. And as long as we continue to have a system that refuses to recognize that and instead says we need to fix their parents, and if they won't be fixed, we'll take their kids away, we're not going to have a truly just society.
Hi, my name is Christy Rennick, and I'm co-executive director of Fostering Media Connections. If you're enjoying the Imprint Weekly podcast, please consider supporting it and all the other great work our team is doing. Every day, Fostering Media Connections is reporting on important child welfare and youth justice news through the Imprint, our daily news site. We're reaching foster and kinship caregivers directly in their homes with our award-winning magazine, Fostering Families Today. We help youth with lived experience share their stories and views through our Youth Voices Rising program. And we recently launched Safe Camp Audio, a podcast network featuring a wide range of shows on youth, families, justice, and the social safety net. To support our work and the amazing people who do it, please visit fosteringmediaconnections.org/donate. That's fosteringmediaconnections.org/donate. Thank you.
So I usually don't love like magic wand questions, but I think it's kind of appropriate here. I'm hopeful that this year is going to move the conversation from setting a framework of abolition and transformation or whatever people feel to actually talking about like how these things get into laws and things like that. So if you were able to affect one major change on the existing system, one non-reformist reform, what would it be? I'll give you could pick one federal one and one state one, because as you know, the feds have certain things they can influence and certain things they really can't. So just curious what on either level, what you would start with.
Well, one would be to take huge amounts of money that are devoted to taking children away from their families and maintaining them outside their families and give it directly to families. I mean, maybe that's still, well, you gave me a magic wand, so I did.
Yeah.
That sounds magical, but that.
Although kind of in reality also right now with the child allowances a little bit.
Well, that's an example that shows that it can be done, but I would like to see it as a direct transfer of funds from the billions of dollars that are being spent now on taking children and keeping them away from their families, instead giving that money directly to families to care for their children.
You hear a lot about the concept, if you just focus tested lines about how people feel in child welfare, about changing it, this would be the 100% one, is like, we need to stop confusing poverty with neglect, right? Recently, we published an essay by Jess McDonald, who I think was running Illinois system when you were writing about it.
Well, Jess was with me on that panel. He was one of the 5 experts that was performing foster care in Washington State. So I know. So Jess, you're absolutely right. He was the head of DCFS when I was writing Shattered Bonds. I was teaching at Northwestern in Chicago at the time. And that was when I first met him. In fact, I can remember very, very vividly, the first time I met Jess was when I gave a talk about racism in the child welfare system. And he came up to me with a stack of data. He was trying to convince me that DCFS was getting better under his watch. And then we ended up working together on this expert panel that was supposed to fix the problems of foster care in Washington State. So I know Jess very well.
So he and a colleague, Tom Morton, who I think you've cited a couple times in the book, but they wrote an essay for us that, I don't know, it got me thinking. It was an interesting concept. Basically, they were making a case. There's a lot of talk about this confusion of poverty with neglect. Well, we shouldn't be addressing poverty or neglect using the same process we use for abuse. And I'm curious what you think of that framing. I mean, I guess they were really trying to say is like, we think of neglect as this antisocial behavior, and it's not in the way that abuse is. So why do we have one system that does both?
Yeah, well, I think I haven't read it, so I don't want to comment too specifically about it, but it's true that one of the ways in which our current child welfare system punishes poverty is through the definition of neglect, or defining neglect basically in terms of poverty. And we also know that the child welfare system historically has been designed to deal with poor families. I mean, that's absolutely the case, and that's the historic origins of our child welfare system, are rooted from the Elizabethan laws of the poor laws of dealing with poor families as a way of addressing poor children's needs without addressing poverty. by taking them away from their families instead of creating a society where children and families aren't impoverished. The child welfare system is a system mainly for impoverished families. Very rare that wealthy people get involved in it, regardless of what happens in their homes. So part of the resistance I would have to separating the two is that it's not the case that if we separate the two, we're going to fix the child welfare system, because the system itself is designed to intrude in, police, and punish marginalized communities. And one thing that they have in common generally is poverty, because that's how our society is structured, to impoverish certain groups of people. So I would want to address that as well. In other words, it's not just a problem with the legal definition. The legal definition facilitates the purpose of the system, but it's not as if if we just change the definition, we're going to fix things. And then the other point is that we also need to deal with violence in families in ways that do not require child removal and law enforcement. This is one of the places, I think this isn't acknowledged enough, but one of the places where a movement to abolish the family policing system or child welfare system intersects with the prison abolition movement, because the prison abolition movement has had to deal with the question of violence, including violence in the family, although it's usually restricted to violence against women. But if we included violence against children, we would see that this is a common problem of both movements that we have to grapple with. But in both movements, we know that the ways the prison system and the child welfare system work have not solved the problem of violence. So I would want to have an approach that doesn't separate the two and say, well, one is appropriate for abolition and the other isn't. The other problem with, and I don't, again, I haven't read the piece, so I'm not at all saying that they're equivalent, neglect and physical or sexual abuse. But I think that if a movement to abolish the current approach to child maltreatment has to take account of both of them. Again, that's something that we need to grapple with in terms of abolishing prisons and foster care, what to do about violence. But in both cases, the approach that we have now does not solve the problem. It's been ineffective. We know that there are families that are afraid, especially mothers who are being victimized by violence in the home, and they are afraid to get help because they don't want their children taken away from them. And in many of the cases where the ones publicized in the papers that you read about, of a child who was known to the system and yet was killed in the home, very often it involves a case where the mother and the child were victims of abuse, and the system did not serve either one. And too often, the system harms the family because it blames the mother for allowing violence to occur in the home. That is a counterproductive approach to violence in the home.
I'm sure you've thought of this. What, in a sort of systemless support for families, in the instances where, because I get what you're saying. I mean, there's certainly ways to mitigate violence in a home without taking a child into foster care. You could extricate the violent person from the home, for starters, or whatever, but like in the instances where a child would actually not be safe to stay where they are, in a kind of systemless support system, What do you envision that looking like? What would that part of the systemless I was going to say systemless network. Let's say that. Yeah.
Right. So I want to say very clearly, I do not have definitive answers to any of your questions, because this is partly because I by myself wouldn't want to give an answer that's not backed by lots of dedicated thinking and practice. And I don't think we've had a chance yet to do that kind of innovative thinking and, collective innovative thinking and practice. So I don't want to make it sound like I figured out how to abolish the child welfare system. Even working on a book and spending lots of time on it, a new book on it, I'm setting out a different way of thinking about how to protect, how to make us safer, children, families, all of us safer, and less oppressed as well. So let me couch my answer in an overall point that we have to develop ways of addressing violence within communities that haven't been developed yet. So we have to envision and build work on using ideas and practices that have been shown to be fruitful, like transformative justice practices, where you hold people accountable for violence without caging them and punishing them the way that we do now. And so we need to work on community-based ways of giving people refuge who need it, and also holding accountable people who perpetrate violence. One thing that the prison abolition movement has made clear is that there isn't, and I think actually this was clear in my statements about domestic violence just now, that there isn't a clear-cut division between perpetrators and survivors of violence. And there are people who experience violence who also inflict it. This is one of the contradictions, I think, of the child welfare system we have now, is that it very easily treats children as if it's saving them from violence, and then inflicts violence on them. And many of them end up in the street, in juvenile detention centers, in prisons, after they've been supposedly rescued from violence or other kinds of maltreatment from their homes. So we want, instead of that kind of treatment of children that so easily turns from rescuing to punishment, a way of thinking about human beings that's more compassionate and caring. That's going to take both creating means of restorative and transformative justice within communities, but also changing the reasons why people are violent. I mean, there are stresses from intense economic deprivation that have been shown to be related to violence. There are ideologies in US culture that promote male violence. There are ideas about control of children, not just by parents, but by the state, in our juvenile detention centers, in the solitary confinement of children in the United States, in the transfer of children to adult prisons, which all of that, to police officers assaulting children in schools, police officers handcuffing 5-year-olds. I mean, we live in a society that's full of violence against children, and it's not being committed by parents. So the idea that a child welfare system, by taking children from their parents, is going to address violence, that's just a fraction of all the violence that goes on against children in the United States. We have children who are being poisoned by lead in the water. by government officials, and nothing really, they're not held accountable for it. We need to address violence in a much broader way. Again, this is something that Black feminists in the prison abolition movement, anti-carceral feminists, have pointed out that there is a connection between state violence in prisons, in the streets, and in detention centers, in solitary confinement, and violence in the home. And we can't believe, I think it's ludicrous to believe that the state perpetrators of violence are the people we should turn to figure out how to create a nonviolent America. I think that there's much better examples in communities who care about each other, for how to address violence. And that's what we need to develop and support. That's where the money should go. Let's take, you asked me, what would I do if I had a magic wand? Let's take all that money that's being spent on incarcerating, caging, putting kids in solitary confinement in horrible detention centers, therapeutic treatment centers, and spend it on community-based, loving and caring ways of addressing people's needs and solving conflicts. Right now, the child welfare system creates conflicts in communities. We need a radically different way. And I believe we can do it. We have historical examples of where communities come together. I was just writing in the history section of my book about how before these charitable organizations that were taking white children and apprenticing them out to work for people and calling that foster care, and creating orphanages for them, and they excluded Black children. But I should say that Black children were apprenticed out to their former enslavers routinely after emancipation. But the charitable kind, supposedly charitable kind, where Black children were excluded. Well, who took care of Black children in need? It was Black churches and Black women's organizations that were able to care without the support they should have gotten, because of course they were denied the wealth and the benefits and all of the privileges that white families got. But even despite that, despite coming out of enslavement, they were able to figure out ways to care for children in need. I think those are, and other community examples are there for us to be inspired by and to learn from. And I, after working on this for 20 years, I cannot have any more faith in a system that hasn't changed fundamentally, continues to cause so many harms and trauma and suffering to families, and has not solved the problems it claims to solve. And if anything, obscures and diverts our attention from the real structural inequities that are harming children in America. And that's what we need, an approach that can address those contradictions and figure out a new way, radically new way of relating to each other in loving and caring ways, instead of continuing to rely on threats and violence and intimidation and separation of children from their families.
Are you a professional in the field of child welfare, juvenile justice, or other family and youth services? Subscribe today to Youth Services Insider, the imprint's exclusive section on all the insider news you need to stay in the know. Funding opportunities, major federal and state policy shifts, interviews with key leaders in the field. It's all available only for our Youth Services Insider subscribers. Sign up for a monthly or yearly subscription today by visiting imprintnews.org/subscribe. Our podcast listeners get 10% off their subscription by entering the promo code podcast10. That's imprintnews.org/subscribe and get 10% off your subscription by entering the promo code podcast10 today.
I want to ask you a UPenn question, but it's
Sure.
also about how you sharpen up your ideas and how you go about forming your view of things.
Mhm.
So you lead the Penn program on race, science, and society.
Yes.
On campus, I've never been there, but I would assume pretty close by is the Field Center for Children's Policy, Practice, and Research. Founding director is the late Richard Gellis. Definitely had some different ideas than you do on child welfare and particularly family reunification. I've always wondered, did you guys have a professional relationship? Did you ever bounce ideas off each other? And do the two programs ever work on child welfare issues and research together now?
Let me first say about Richard Gellis. Richard Gellis and I, you're absolutely right. We were diametrically opposed on questions of intervention in families. As you know, he advocated for more. I advocated for less. He thought the system was good and should be exaggerated, right? Even more. I thought the system was bad and
I always thought of him as kind of taking the bend that it shouldn't be big, but it should be pretty harsh when it did intervene. Okay. Do you think I'm wrong there? Yeah, I don't know.
No, that's okay. All right, but let's just, he was more for intensification, whether that means harsher or bigger, but more intensified intervention in families. And so we had our disagreements. We once had a debate at Penn when I think I was at Northwestern at the time. And I have to say, it was so unfairly set up in my favor because Marty Guggenheim was the moderator.
Oh, wow.
For your listeners who don't know, Marty Guggenheim is a longtime advocate for family defense at NYU and pulls no punches. So it was unfair to Richard Gellis. But so I've been in debates with him. I have to say, when I came to Penn as a Penn Integrates Knowledge professor, which is a university professorship where the professor is appointed in two different schools. And it was clear I was going to be in the law school. And there was a question, what other school? And Richard lobbied for me to be in the School of Social Policy and Practice. So even though we disagreed, we had a respectful disagreement. Let's put it that way. And the last time I met with Richard was not too long before he died. He was putting together, I'm not sure what happened to it, a kind of webinar series, and he invited me to be interviewed. He interviewed me for a segment of it on racism in the child welfare system. I've never seen what
I tried to unearth that.
Yeah. So, he was asking me questions and I was saying it like it is. And I thought he must disagree with everything I'm saying. But as far as I know, he was going to make it part of the series. So we disagreed, but we had I would say, a cordial and respectful professional relationship. The Field Center, I participated in for a while. I was kind of excited about it when I came to Penn. I have to say, I disagreed a lot with some of the activities they engaged in, and somehow we kind of parted ways. I stopped attending meetings there. I feel like I was no longer invited to attend meetings there, but I believe that it's under new leadership now. Someone had a conversation with me about my ideas for change at the Field Center. They did produce recently a webinar on family defense, which I listened to, which was, I thought, really helpful and enlightening and very much on the side of radically changing things in child welfare. So I do look forward to rekindling my relationship to the Field Center.
So let me close out with this. It's been 20 years since Shattered Bonds. You don't really feel like any real progress has been made in child welfare. 20 years from now, we're at 2041, right? I'm not great at math. 2041. Are you optimistic or pessimistic that 20 years from now, you're going to look at the lay of the land and feel like this is fundamentally different?
I'm more optimistic than I ever have been. I think that there is a sea change in approaches now. I think that we are seeing an abolitionist movement that is committed to a completely different way of addressing families' needs and conflicts and providing for them, caring for them, true child care. And there's much more voice and leadership given to parents who and children who've been involved in foster care. The leadership of Black mothers like Joyce McMillan, for example, in New York City, is much more accentuated and having more of an influence than it has in the past. And there are organizations like Movement for Family Power that are dedicated to abolition. There's networks building. I think people are starting to see the connections between the Black Lives Matter movement and the prison abolition movement. And if we can join forces in all the ways that we have common interests and values and visions and understandings of how these systems operate, I think that there's real hope for fundamental change. And I hope to see it. I'm hoping to publish this book. I have a contract to publish it.
So you better than
I need to get the manuscript in. I'm furiously writing it and sending in chapters to my editor at Basic Books, but it's scheduled to be published next spring by Basic Books. And I'm focusing on getting that written, but I really want to jump into this movement and help to galvanize it and strengthen it with many others. And I think this conference, again, to get back to the symposium that you began with, I think it's an indication. There are, as of this morning, there were over 1,000 people who had registered for it. It's 2 full days. So I'm giving the keynote, and there are responders on Thursday evening, and then 2 full days of papers and presentations by activists and scholars and researchers, students, just a wide range of disciplines also. It's so exciting. I haven't seen so much excitement around a conference in my recent experience. It's explicitly an abolitionist conference. I find also students who are interested, graduate students in social work, sociology, history, political science, law students. I've never seen this kind of dedication to making fundamental change in this field. I feel very excited and hopeful. I think this is diametrically different from when I wrote Shattered Bonds, and the approach was, how can we reform things to narrow the gap between the terrible things that happen to Black children and the terrible things that happen to white children. It's a different approach, completely different approach, which is how do we radically change the very relationship between ourselves, between the government and families, between families and communities, between children and families, right? To really meet people's needs without relying on policing and carceral systems.
So the conference is called Strengthened Bonds, Abolishing the Child Welfare System and Re-envisioning Child Wellbeing. It is from March 25th to the 27th. I think you can still register. I think it's still available online to register. So Professor Dorothy Roberts, thank you so much for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Thank you so much, John.
Thanks for joining us today for this summer rewind edition of the Imprint Weekly Podcast. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of the Safe Camp Audio Network, which is a division of Fostering Media Connections. Please visit safecampaudio.org on the web or at safecampaudio on all major social media. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Adjoko, with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elia. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we would greatly appreciate if you would consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, it is very easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow The Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @TheImprintNews and visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. You can email us at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.